The cart rattled to a stop at the edge of a narrow clearing, its wooden wheels sinking into the wet earth. Clara held her breath, clutching a small linen bundle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The driver didn't look at her as he climbed down, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat soaked from mountain fog. He pulled her down roughly, set her on the cold ground, and without a word swung back up onto the cart. The horse snorted and turned, hooves splashing mud as they disappeared into the gray, winding trail. Clara turned, trembling, and faced the ranch. The building looked more like a dark wound in the forest than a home. Its roof sagged under heavy pine branches, its narrow windows clouded with grime. She felt her stomach tighten as if a rope had been knotted deep inside her. She remembered her uncle's last words. "Do what they say, don't speak unless spoken to, you'll stay alive." A figure stood on the porch, tall, unmoving, wrapped in a black wool coat buttoned to the throat. His face was pale and sharp, eyes fixed on her with an emptiness that froze her feet to the ground. A single heavy step forward. Clara's heart beat so hard it filled her ears. She took a shaky breath and forced her feet to move, dragging herself toward the porch. Each step felt like sinking deeper into cold water. When she finally reached the first wooden step, she looked up. The man didn't offer a hand or speak. His eyes followed her, cold and measuring, as if she were nothing more than a stray animal left at his door. Clara swallowed. The door behind him creaked open, a thin line of darkness yawning inside. She clutched her bundle closer, lowered her head, and stepped inside. The door groaned shut behind her, the final echo sealing her fate in the silent, heavy air. The door closed behind her with a slow, final groan. Clara stood frozen in the entryway, her eyes struggling to adjust to the heavy darkness inside. The air smelled of damp wood, ash, and something sour that clung to her skin immediately. A single oil lamp flickered on a narrow table nearby, throwing long shadows across the warped floorboards. The man in the black wool coat stepped past her without a word, his boots thudding in a slow, unbroken rhythm. She followed him, her fingers digging into her bundle, her heart drumming painfully against her ribs. He stopped in front of a small room to the left. "This is yours," he said flatly, his voice scraping against her like a blunt blade. She nodded, stepping forward to peek inside. A narrow cot against the wall, a chipped basin on the floor, and a small window covered with iron bars. He turned abruptly and moved toward the back of the house. "Up before sunrise, no doors opened unless I say, no questions." His voice echoed down the hall, swallowing any thought she might have formed. Clara lowered her head, stepping fully into the small room. She set her bundle on the cot and pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. Through the thin walls, she heard his footsteps fade into a distant creaking upstairs. Then, a sudden crash of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded her clothes, each piece a fragile memory of the life she had lost. Outside, the wind rattled the boards, as if the forest itself whispered warnings she couldn't quite hear. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, her shoulders hunched forward. In the suffocating stillness, she realized she had already begun to disappear, piece by piece, silence by silence. When the first pale light seeped through the barred window, Clara forced herself to stand. Her bones felt heavy, her eyes raw from a night of shallow, restless sleep. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped into the hallway, every creak beneath her feet echoing like a warning shot. In the kitchen, she found the old maid already bent over a battered stove. The woman's hair was pulled back so tightly it looked painful, her thin shoulders trembling with each motion. Steam rose from a dented pot, filling the air with the sharp smell of boiled roots. Across the room, a young stable boy crouched near a bucket, scrubbing muddy boots in silence. He was no older than 16, his hair falling in damp strands over his eyes. When he glanced up at Clara, she saw a hollow, empty stare, and he quickly looked away, as if even eye contact might get them both punished. The maid turned, her eyes flicking over Clara's face before dropping to her hands. She thrust a rag toward her, lips tightening. Without a word, she gestured to a pile of filthy plates stacked on the floor. Clara took the rag, her fingers brushing the maid's. They were cold and brittle, like dead twigs. The boy rose suddenly, grabbing the bucket and slipping out the back door. She watched his narrow shoulders vanish into the gray morning fog, his head bowed. The kitchen fell into a sharp, unnatural quiet, broken only by the soft clatter of dishes as Clara began to scrub. She wanted to speak, to ask the maid where he went, to ask how long they had all been here. But the words stuck in her throat, thick as old syrup. The maid did not look at her again. For the first time, Clara realized here words were not just dangerous. They were forbidden. Every silent glance, every quickened step spoke louder than any plea for help ever could. Days dissolved into one another like slow-moving shadows. Clara moved from task to task, her hands raw and red, her eyes always scanning the edges of each room. She noticed things no one mentioned. Thick scratches on the inside of the kitchen door, as if someone had clawed at it in a final panic. Heavy iron locks on storage doors, bolts that looked too strong for a simple ranch house. At night, when she lay on the narrow cot, she heard floorboards groan and whisper under unseen feet. One evening, she lingered in the hallway longer than usual. A faded photograph hung crooked on the wall. A young girl standing beside the same porch where Clara had first arrived. The girl's face was pinched and wary, her eyes wide and empty in a way that felt painfully familiar. Clara raised her hand to straighten the frame, but stopped halfway. Afraid even that small gesture might be punished. Sometimes she glimpsed the owner's silhouette outside her door, a pale shape moving past like a drifting specter. The moment she heard his steps, her breath caught, her spine locking into stone. The stable boy returned each dawn, with mud caked to his knees, always avoiding her gaze. Once she saw him slip something into the old maid's hand, a scrap of paper or a folded cloth. But it vanished so quickly she wondered if she imagined it. Silence became its own kind of language, a thick veil smothering every small rebellion that sparked inside her. Clara realized she was learning to move like the others, careful, wordless, watching the floor instead of the walls, counting breaths instead of hours. Each day chipped away a little more of her voice, her will, leaving behind a quiet shell that blended seamlessly into the house's heavy gloom. Morning fog still clung to the ground when Clara hurried into the kitchen, her arms trembling under the weight of a full water bucket. Her breath rose in quick, panicked clouds as she stepped over the threshold. Her foot caught on the edge of a warped floorboard. In an instant, the bucket tipped forward, crashing to the ground. Water gushed across the floor, seeping into the cracks and curling around her ankles like cold fingers. The noise snapped through the house like a whip. Clara dropped to her knees, grabbing the rag, her hands moving frantically to soak up the spreading puddle. A shadow filled the doorway. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The owner stepped inside, boots thudding against the soaked boards. Clara kept her head bowed, her heart thrashing in her chest. His silence weighed heavier than any curse. Suddenly his hand lashed out, striking her cheek with a sharp crack that sent her sprawling backward. The rag slipped from her fingers, her head spinning. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her forward so violently she tasted blood. "Useless!" he hissed, his breath hot and sour against her ear. He shoved her face down toward the wet floor, her cheek pressed against the cold wood. "You stay here," he said slowly, each word punctuated by the tightening of his grip. "Until it's dry, until I say." He released her, and she slumped forward, coughing. The door slammed behind him, echoing like a cell door in her skull. Clara lay on the floor, her hands trembling as she gathered the rag again. The water soaked into her dress, chilling her to the bone. She pressed her forehead to the boards, her breath shallow and uneven. In that moment she understood. The floor would dry long before the fear inside her ever would. The night pressed in around her, heavy and endless. Clara sat on the cold kitchen floor, her fingers raw from hours of scrubbing. When she finally finished, she crawled back to her room, her legs unsteady beneath her. She found the old maid in the narrow hallway carrying a stack of folded cloths. Their eyes met for an instant. Something almost human flickered in the maid's face before it vanished. Clara's voice slipped out, cracked and small. What if I tried to leave?" The maid's eyes widened, her lips parting in silent horror. Before she could answer, a hard shadow filled the hallway. The owner stood behind them, his face unreadable in the dim lamplight. Clara felt her stomach twist into a hard knot. Without warning, he lunged forward, seizing her wrist in a bruising grip. She let out a strangled cry as he dragged her down the hallway, her feet scraping against the floor. The maid shrank back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ground. At the end of the hall, he flung open a narrow wooden door and shoved her inside. The room reeked of mold and iron. She stumbled, hitting her shoulder against the splintered wall. The door slammed shut, a lock clicked, and silence swallowed her whole. Clara's breath echoed in the darkness, shallow and sharp. She pressed her palms against the walls, feeling the rough edges of nails and old splinters cut into her skin. Her fingers found a cold, rusted chain bolted to the floor, the metal biting into her touch like teeth. She sank down, curling into herself on the damp ground. The air was thick and stifling, each inhale tasting of dust and rot. Her heart pounded so loudly it felt as though it might crack her ribs. In that darkness she understood. Here, questions were not just forbidden. They were punishable by disappearance. The blackness in the storage room felt alive, shifting around her with each shallow breath. Clara pressed her back against the wall, straining her ears for any hint of movement outside. Nothing. Only her own ragged breathing and the steady drip of water somewhere deep in the walls. Her hands fumbled across the floor, tracing broken boards and patches of dampness. Her fingers brushed against something soft and crumpled in a corner. She crawled toward it, her heartbeat echoing through her skull. It was a crate, its lid half open and lined with dust. Inside she found a dress, old, torn at the hem, stained in places she didn't want to imagine. A thin apron lay folded beneath it, its fabric brittle and yellowed with age. Clara lifted the dress slowly, the smell of earth and old sweat rising to meet her. She held it close to her face, her eyes burning in the dark. Who had worn it? What happened to her? She imagined the girl standing where she now crouched, clutching that same dress, whispering the same silent questions to the shadows. In that cramped space, Clara felt the walls lean closer, as if listening to her thoughts. A wave of nausea crawled up her throat. She pressed the fabric against her chest, her fingers knotting into it. A pulse of determination flickered somewhere deep under her fear. Someone else had been here before her. Someone else had tried to endure. Clara lowered her head, feeling the rough floor beneath her knees. She wasn't the first, and she knew now she couldn't become another ghost sewn into the silence of this house. When the door finally creaked open at dawn, cold light spilled across the storage floor like a blade. Clara squinted, her eyes burning after hours in the dark. The owner stood in the doorway, his broad silhouette blocking the rest of the hall. Without a word, he reached forward and yanked her up by the arm. Her legs buckled, weak from the night on the damp boards. He dragged her to the main hallway, the long corridor where portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. There, he shoved her down to her knees. The wood was rough and splintered, biting into her skin immediately. "Clean!" he ordered, throwing a stiff brush at her feet. Clara's fingers curled around the handle, shaking. Her knees scraped forward as she began to scrub, each stroke loud in the hollow silence. Blood mixed with the dirty water almost instantly, her skin breaking open in thin, stinging cuts. He stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching her without the smallest flicker of emotion. She tried not to cry out, to keep her breathing steady, but each movement sent a fresh shock of pain up her legs and into her spine. Her thin dress clung to her back, soaked with sweat and filth. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each board another reminder that she was trapped in this unyielding ritual. Every brushstroke felt like it scraped something from her soul, leaving her more hollow, more silent. When her arm finally went numb, she dared a quick glance upward. The owner's eyes were fixed on her, cold, flat, as if he were staring at a stray animal rather than a human being. Clara lowered her head again, her forehead nearly touching the wet floor. Each stroke of the brush became a small, desperate prayer. Let me finish, let me survive, let me find a way out. When the last board in the hallway had been scrubbed raw, the owner ordered Clara to stand. Her arms felt like dead weight, her knees slick with blood and grime. She rose slowly, each movement a silent scream through her bones. He guided her up the narrow staircase, his hand gripping her elbow so tightly she felt the bruises blooming under his fingers. At the top, he pushed open a heavy door. "Clean," he said again, his voice low and final. Clara stepped inside. The air was sharp and cold, smelling of rust and old sweat. Her eyes swept the room and her stomach turned. Chains hung from iron bolts driven deep into the floor, the metal links worn smooth by struggle. In the corner, a pile of shoes lay scattered, small and large, all weather-worn and stained with dirt. Some shoes had broken laces, others still held the faint shape of feet long gone. On the far wall, claw marks etched into the wood reached almost to the ceiling, a desperate record of hands searching for freedom. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, her mind piecing together the horror. This wasn't a storage room. It was a cell, a silent witness to countless attempts at escape and punishment. She bent to pick up one of the shoes, her fingers tracing the torn seams. The leather felt ghostly under her touch, heavy with unspoken stories. A sudden clang behind her made her flinch, the door closing halfway, his shadow lingering at the threshold. She set the shoe down carefully and began to clean, her movements mechanical, her mind churning beneath her calm surface. Each sweep of her rag across the floor felt like an unspoken vow. She would not become another pair of forgotten shoes, another set of scratches on the wall. In that freezing room, among the ghosts of all who failed before her, Clara felt something shift deep inside. A fragile ember of resolve, stubborn and burning. The rest of the day unfolded in a thick, sickening haze. Clara moved through her chores like a broken puppet, her limbs heavy and unsteady. Her mind refused to settle, replaying the sight of those chains and shoes again and again. At dinner, she sat across the long wooden table from the owner. The old maid served a thin, tasteless broth, keeping her eyes low. The stable boy entered silently, set down a stack of empty buckets, and slipped out again without touching the food. Clara stared at her bowl, her fingers curling tightly around the spoon. Each scrape of metal against the bowl grated against her bones. She risked a glance upward. The owner's hands rested on the table, long fingers tapping slowly, almost rhythmically. Her eyes followed those hands, and a memory surfaced. A flash of them gripping her hair, dragging her across the hall. Another flicker. She imagined those same hands wrapping around a wrist that wasn't hers, tightening until all sound vanished. A shiver passed down her spine. The maid noticed. Her face twitched, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. There was something there, a warning, a silent plea, or maybe even a fragment of shared defiance. But it vanished as quickly as it came. That night, Clara stood alone in her small room, her reflection in the cracked mirror barely recognizable. Hollow eyes, bruises blooming across her cheek and arms, hair tangled like old rope. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. In a hoarse whisper, she spoke to the ghost, staring back. "I won't stay, I won't end here." For the first time, the words felt real, solid enough to stand on. She pressed her forehead to the mirror, her fists trembling at her sides. Someone had tried before her. They had failed, but she would not. In that moment, alone in the dark, Clara made her silent vow. The house had taken almost everything, but not her will, not yet. The house groaned and shifted under the weight of the wind that night. Clara lay awake, her heart hammering beneath the thin blanket, each gust outside sounding like a footstep in the hall. A soft creak came from beyond her door. She sat up sharply, straining to hear. The handle turned, and a thin line of lamplight spilled into the room. The old maid slipped inside, her bony hands trembling as she pressed the door closed behind her. For a moment she just stood there, eyes glinting in the faint light, her breath ragged and quick. Clara swung her feet to the floor, her voice caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. The maid took 2 hesitant steps forward. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out a small, cold iron key. Her fingers closed around Clara's, pushing it into her palm. Her whisper came out like a broken reed. "At dawn, take the lower path, past the shed, don't look back." Clara's breath hitched. She stared at the key, its sharp edges biting into her skin as if to wake her from a dream. The maid grabbed her shoulders suddenly, shaking her so hard Clara's teeth clacked together. "Don't look back!" she repeated, her eyes wide with fear, or urgency, or both. Clara nodded, her whole body shivering. The maid released her and stepped back, her hand hovering in the air as though she wanted to say more but couldn't. Then, just as quickly as she had come, the maid turned and slipped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind her. Clara stared at the key, her fingers closing tight around it until her knuckles went white. In that fragile piece of iron, she felt the weight of every silent cry, every hidden scar left in this house, and for the first time she felt the flicker of a path, terrifying, narrow, but hers. The hours before dawn crawled like wounded animals. Clara sat on the edge of her cot, the key burning cold against her palm. Every few minutes she pressed it tighter, as if testing whether it was real or just another cruel trick. She moved quietly, her bare feet careful on the creaking boards. From a basket near her door, she took the old bread knife she'd hidden days ago, and from the sewing box, the small pair of scissors she'd kept secret beneath folded cloth. She wrapped a piece of stale bread in a torn scrap of linen and tucked it into the thin shawl she would carry. Her fingers shook as she tied each knot, her breath catching in short, nervous gasps. In her mind, she repeated the maid's words like a prayer. Lower path, past the shed, don't look back. Over and over the rhythm pounded against her skull, steadying her when her hands threatened to betray her. Outside her window, the sky shifted from black to a deep bruised blue. The forest beyond the fence looked like a wall of silent witnesses waiting to swallow her. She listened for footsteps, for the jangle of keys, for the sudden creak of the owner's door. But the house lay still, as if it too were holding its breath. Clara pressed her forehead to the cold glass, her eyes flicking across the yard, memorizing every shadow and corner. Then she rose, pulling the shawl tight around her shoulders. She slipped the knife and scissors into its folds, tucking them close to her ribs. At the door she paused, her fingers brushing the rough wood one last time. "Go!" She turned the key slowly, the lock clicking open like the crack of a gunshot in her ears. She swallowed the rising terror and eased the door forward, stepping into the dim hallway. The first steps felt like stepping off a cliff, weightless, irreversible. Each heartbeat thundered in her throat as she slipped toward the back of the house, the exit she had memorized in her restless, haunted nights. She didn't look back. She wouldn't. The first gray strands of dawn slid across the yard as Clara stepped into the open air. The cold slapped her face, sharp and immediate, but she didn't pause. She moved like a hunted animal, her feet barely making a sound against the packed dirt. Each breath cut into her lungs, but she forced it down, her eyes locked on the narrow gap beyond the shed, the lower path the maid had whispered about. But just as she reached the edge of the yard, a sudden shape blocked her view. The owner stood there, his coat buttoned tight, his breath fogging the air in slow, steady clouds. His eyes glowed pale in the weak morning light, fixed on her like knives. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Clara felt her heart slam against her ribs, her fingers curling around the hidden scissors in her shawl. Then he stepped forward, his hand snapping out to seize her arm. The force of it spun her sideways, her shoulder jolting with pain. She let out a strangled cry as he yanked her back toward the house, his grip crushing her flesh. "No!" she gasped, twisting, fighting to break free. But he was too strong. His fingers dug in like iron. Her other hand fumbled at her side, slipping under the shawl. She felt the cold metal handle of the scissors and pulled them free in a single, desperate motion. With a wild scream that sounded more like an animal than a person, she plunged the scissors into his side. His body jerked, his eyes flared wide, mouth falling open in a silent, shocked breath. The grip on her arm loosened. She stumbled backward, nearly falling, the scissors slipping from her blood-slicked hand onto the ground. He staggered, one hand pressing to his side, dark red blooming through the fabric of his coat. His gaze fixed on her, confused and disbelieving, as though the world itself had betrayed him. Clara didn't wait. She turned and ran, her feet pounding over the frost-hardened ground, the pain in her lungs overshadowed by the roar in her head. Go! 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 Behind her, a guttural cry rose, echoing across the yard. She didn't dare look back. Clara tore through the yard, her breath bursting in ragged, searing gasps. The pale morning light slashed across her face, illuminating the blood smeared along her hands and forearms. She crashed into the trees beyond the shed, branches whipping against her skin, snagging her hair, tearing at her thin dress. The ground beneath her feet turned treacherous. Tangled roots, slick mud, and sharp stones that cut into her soles with each frantic step. Her heart thrashed inside her chest like a trapped bird. Each pulse screamed faster, each stumble threatened to throw her to the ground for good. Behind her, a roar rose and fell, somewhere between a wounded animal and a furious curse. She didn't look back. Her mind clung to the maid's words, "Don't look back, don't listen." As she pushed deeper into the forest, mist rose from the ground, wrapping around her legs and blurring the dark trunks into a shifting maze. Her vision blurred with tears and sweat, but she kept moving, her arms flailing forward, pulling her deeper into the choking dawn fog. Thorns sliced across her cheeks and neck, and every new sting jolted her further into survival. The soft morning light filtering through the trees offered no warmth, only an eerie glow that marked each frantic breath. When her legs finally gave out, she fell hard onto the damp forest floor. Her hands clawed at the earth, pulling herself forward on trembling elbows before she forced her body upright again. The woods around her felt endless, alive with echoes and distant snapping branches, but Clara refused to stop. She pushed forward through the thick underbrush, each movement slower, each gasp more desperate. Her body screamed for rest, but her spirit lunged forward with every shuddering beat. In the dim hush of the forest, Clara became a single flicker of movement, a sliver of hope, tearing free through the dark. At last, the trees began to thin. Pale light seeped between the trunks, painting the ground in faint streaks of gray and gold. Clara stumbled into a narrow clearing, her knees buckling beneath her. She collapsed onto the damp earth, her hands sinking into cold mud. Every breath rasped like tearing cloth inside her chest. Her dress clung to her body, heavy with blood, sweat, and forest debris. For a moment, she could only press her forehead to the ground, her fingers clawing at moss and leaves as though she might dig straight through the earth and vanish. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. Beyond the clearing, a narrow path wound down toward the valley below. Beyond that, she could see the faint outline of a distant ridge, washed in the first pale blush of sunrise. A sob ripped from her throat, half relief, half raw, aching grief. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, feeling her heart still pounding like a war drum. Clara pushed herself to her knees, then upright, swaying as if the slightest breeze might topple her. The cold morning air bit at her torn skin, but she felt it, really felt it, as though touching life for the first time. She turned her face toward the rising sun. Light spilled across her hollow cheeks and caught in her tangled hair, turning the edges of her suffering into a fleeting halo. She didn't smile. There was no victory in her expression, only the deep, silent understanding of what she had left behind, and what small, uncertain thread of future lay ahead. Clara took a single step forward, then another. With each shaky movement, she crossed the last invisible borders of the ranch's hold on her. She was free. But the freedom came with scars deeper than any knife, echoing in the silent spaces behind her eyes. As she disappeared down the path, the forest closed behind her, swallowing the final trace of a girl who refused to become another ghost.